everyone, and welcome to today's Seed World Innovation Series webinar. My name is Alex Martin, and I serve as an associate editor for Seed World, and today I'm happy to be your host. Today's theme is Think Outside the Elevator, soy products that open new markets. I'd like to take a minute to thank Benson Hill for partnering with us on this Innovation Series webinar today. Presenting the webinar today is Jeff Johnson, who serves as an executive of Benson Hill. Jeff has over 30 years of experience in the seed industry with broad practical experience in sales and marketing management, strategy development, and operations. Jeff was previously with Syngenta, then formerly employed 19 years with Pioneer, now Corteva, which included 4 years of living in South Africa as the marketing manager for Africa. Jeff has a BS in agriculture education. He has also completed the coursework for a master's program in Ag Ed geared towards international agricultural development with a minor in economics and an emphasis in Latin American studies. During the presentation today, you'll likely have some questions for Jeff. Please go ahead and type these into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we'll address these during the Q&A session we'll hold after he finishes his presentation. We'll also have some poll questions during the presentation. These will pop up in your chat box for you to answer. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available at seedworld.com following the proceedings. We'll also be sending out an email with the link to the webinar. Well, in today's complex and costly agricultural environment, seed companies and growers alike need to be thinking about new sources of revenue beyond the grain commodity market. Food-grade soybean varieties or varieties bred to provide high nutrient content for feed can provide a larger and more scalable revenue opportunity than you may think. Today, Jeff is going to teach us about the high performance and high revenue potential of non-GMO food-grade varieties and about new markets for soybeans with high nutrient content. We'll also learn how to gain access to existing varieties or breed our own non-GMO food-grade varieties. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeff, and I'm going to go ahead and let you take it away.
Thank you, Alex. In today's webinar, as Alex mentioned, we'll be looking at soy opportunities beyond the elevator. But I thought with the approaching Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays, we might take an approach and learn from Charles Dickens' classic A Christmas Tale or A Christmas Carol. Now, don't worry, you're not going to be visited by three spirits, but we will visit the history of soybeans, the current trends, and the opportunities they point to going forward. Now, during the webinar, I'm going to challenge you to set aside your current perspective, and we're going to look through the eyes of three members a bit further down the value chain to see if we might, by understanding their needs, identify some opportunities that might benefit you and your business regardless of where you are in the value chain. And to do that, specifically, we're going to visit and look through the eyes of a poultry feeder, a commercial fryer, and then also a plant-based meat provider. We'll end this with a call to action for those of us that those perspectives provide, and then we'll certainly save some time at the end of the conversation for your questions. So in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa for the first poll question, where we'll get a look at the frame of reference you bring to this webinar. Teresa, would you please go ahead and pull up the first poll question and open the poll? Okay, looks like we have some farmers, a predominance of folks from the input or technology provider, some in the grain trade, and some a little bit further downstream in processing. So we have a nice mix as well as some consumers and media on the call. So interesting mix of folks on the call. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I started with these graphics because the world population has doubled in my lifetime, which might be a reference to how old I am, but I'll bypass that for the moment. National Geographic discussed when we hit 7 billion earlier in this decade, what changes that would bring to the world. And a lot of people focused on the scarcity, but I thought an interesting part that came out of their work is they didn't just talk about producing more by putting our head down and producing faster, but they really talked about the quality of protein, not just total calories in the marketplace. So while some want to climb the ladder and eat more meat in their diet, On the other hand, consumer power has grown as millennials and specifically millennial parents, and they're flexing their consumer power to meet their needs, such as their views on environmental impact, their view of health, or even their viewpoint on animal rights concerns. And that's helped spur an explosion of plant-based protein products, including meatless meat, which we'll discuss later in this webinar. Now, China's in the news recently for trade discussions, but I talk about it here because both the origin of soybeans and it's still the world's largest importer. I placed the personal picture of me on the Great Wall of China in the bottom left of this slide because I think it provides an example for today about changing our perspective. I had a chance to visit the Great Wall of China, and I learned from its history that it was built to keep China's enemies, and particularly invaders from the north, out of the country. But as I stood there standing on the wall, it struck me that it's now become the #1 draw and attraction for international visitors to come to China. I think if we can change our perspective that way and look at challenges from a different viewpoint, we can see some opportunities. And I'm going to apply that lesson as we go through the webinar today. Now, with that growth, we see kind of a double burden of those changing demographics. On one hand, suffering from micronutrient malnutrition, and yet on the other hand, we have about an equal amount currently overweight or suffering from obesity. Here in the U.S., 88% of our consumers say they're willing to pay a premium for healthy foods. So nutrient security means we don't just look at having enough calories, but rather we have to look at the makeup of the food we eat and the perceived ethics under which it was grown, and that matters to consumers. And those consumers are flexing their influence in the market. Now, instead of the spirit of Christmas past, let's look at the history of soybeans in the U.S. I mentioned earlier they originated in China, but they've really been a fairly recent phenomenon in the U.S., only entering the U.S. in the late 1700s. It was interesting in 1904, George Washington Carver, who's pictured on the left, and I put his picture there because he's also my fellow alumnus from Iowa State University, but he discovered the value of oil and protein separately within soybeans. I think that's important, and we'll explore the opportunities that discovered value of those components creates. Now, soybean production only really took off in the U.S. during World War II in the 40s, and then its widespread use as soybean meal for animals actually only in the 50s. So it's been in the last 70 years that we've seen this massive increase. And today, we have more than 80 million acres of soybeans being grown in the U.S., and that's down 10% from where we were last year. The vast majority of the meal crush from that is still being used for animal feed. Now, while acres have expanded, as depicted by the graph on the right, and if you look at the top line of the graph, you see in the last 60 years, we've seen a continual progression and almost an eightfold increase in that soybean production. And then on the bottom, you also see that yields have also increased in the blue line. So we've gotten both more acres and higher yield per acre, so massive amounts of production. In fact, that's equivalent to about 60% of worldwide consumption of 77 grams of protein per person per day. But not only have those acres increased in the bushels, they've also, they've grown at a rapid rate around the world as well, as we see in South America. Today, 1/3 of the U.S. cropland is dedicated to soybean production. That comes from focus, as you see in the bars and the graphs on the left, with over 80% of our R&D investment coming from 4 firms in soybeans and 2/3 of our global calories coming from only 5 crops. It's a marvel of what we can do with focus, but that focus has come at a price. That price? Well, while average acreage and yield have increased, the protein percentage has actually declined. And in fact, the protein percentage on a crude level in North America is lower than production in Brazil, for example. That myopic focus on yield has created trade-offs between producing more bushels that growers are paid for and the specific component qualities that others further down the value chain are actually willing to pay us for. And I think that value and a view of that value creates some opportunities. I'll use this graphic a couple times during the webinar today, but I think it's helpful if we look to the left and move to the right that as an industry, we've tended to define quality from a farmer-centric view. They define quality based on how they're paid, such as yield or the defensive agronomic traits needed to protect the yield, or sometimes even to avoid dockage at the elevator that they might get for physical grain quality, such as moisture level or damage, discoloration, foreign material, but mostly physical characteristics. If you start to move further right in the middle of this graph, down the value chain, you see processors are looking more for the compositional parts or the nutritional quality of that grain. They might be looking specifically at protein concentration levels, or even the elements of that protein quality, like the amino acid concentration or the anti-nutrient levels. They might be looking at oil levels or the oil nutritional makeup. Looking even further down to the right on this, we see that as you get to food processors and packaged good and retailers, that sensory qualities take on even greater importance. Flavor's king, color, texture are all important. So if you think back to the picture I showed you on the Great Wall of China, if we understand the challenges these different producers or processors and end users are having with the product, I think we can see some opportunities where we might be able to capture some additional value. Well, processors define soybean quality by the components of the grain, or even more specifically, the specific parts of that grain that they use after it's crushed, such as the soybean meal or the oil. I like this graphic from the United Soybean Board that shows, on average, about from a 60-pound bushel of soybeans, a processor might get approximately 48 pounds of soybean meal, somewhere in the range of 10.5 to 11 pounds of oil, with the rest in moisture and shrinkage. But growers don't have to settle for average, and that's what this slide is, just an average. There are soybean varieties available that have much higher levels of protein and different types of oil makeup. And these differences are vitally important to processors and end users, and they're willing to pay for them, which I think creates some value that can be captured in the marketplace. So if we take a simple look at how soybeans are used, about 70% of the U.S. production goes to feed, about 24% to oil, and about 6% directly to food. So we're going to change our optics today and pick a member of the value chain from each one of these three segments. And as I mentioned, we're going to use a poultry feeder to focus on soybean meal, a commercial fryer working with soybean oil, and a plant-based meat company on the food side. So Teresa, let's queue up the next poll question and open that poll. You'll have a chance to answer this poll question. You may wonder why when I said we're going to look at poultry, am I showing pigs? And the idea is that different animals need different rations. And we'll give you just a couple more moments if you haven't answered yet and would like a chance. Lunch is not dependent on your answer to this question. In fact, there is no lunch, so there's no penalty for how you answer. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. So a mixture of responses, and I think one of the things that's valuable in soybean meal is it's such a high quality food and it has a balance of these essential amino acids. And so all of the amino acids listed are important, but what you would find for swine specifically, C tends to be the more limiting. When we work with lysine, particularly because there's so much corn in pork rations, threonine and tryptophan. When we move over to our next slide and look at poultry, you'll see that A would be a profile that might fit more for what a poultry producer is looking for. I mentioned earlier that 98% of soybean meal goes to animal feed. And of that, 55% goes to feeding poultry, and that's rapidly expanding industry. So let's look through the eyes of a poultry feeder and what they need from soybeans. As I talk with producers and as I get in and actually talk with some nutritionists, they're balancing rations based on amino acid profiles, not just crude protein. So that gets at the quality, not just the quantity of protein. Now, certainly they need abundant quality or abundant quantity, but more importantly, they need that specific amino acid profile that you see here on the right side of the screen. Normally, a wet chemistry analysis is needed to see those specific amino acid profiles. And yet that's not something that regularly appears in seed catalogs. Soybean meal contains oligosaccharides such as raffinose and stachyose that cannot be digested by a lot of monogastric animals. These so-called anti-nutritionals can cause stomach irritation, flatulence, diarrhea, all decreasing bird health, feed efficiency, and rate of gain, which obviously are all economically important to the poultry feeder. Now, usually soybeans have to undergo heat during processing to destroy those anti-nutritionals such as trypsin inhibitors. But under and overheating can depress average daily gain in broilers. Overheating can actually decrease the availability of some of these heat-sensitive yet vitally important amino acids. So besides breeding for higher levels of protein, our full suite of tools in breeding and science allows us to tweak the amino acid profiles for specific species. I believe there's an industry opportunity to provide soybeans with low raffinose and stachyose. Through the application of our full science toolkit, we're working to provide those feed ingredients that meet those designer requirements, rather than just the average we saw on the previous slide. We found this can be done without actually sacrificing competitive yields. I think the old paradigm that growers have to trade yield to get higher levels of protein or better quality protein no longer have to hold true. I believe there's an opportunity for growers to increase contracting for identity preserved products that aren't just focused on a small slice that's organic and food grade. And I think this is a big opportunity moving forward. Let's switch our perspective now from the poultry producer through looking through the eyes of a commercial fryer. Soybean oil in the U.S. is the most used cooking oil. In fact, it's estimated that about 7% of the calories consumed by Americans come from soybean oil. And that's according to the Soy Nutrition Institute. But a commercial fryer has other challenges. And I'm not talking about just the bottle of oil you might use in your kitchen at home. So beyond the shelf life, they want it to hold up to temperature, that so-called high smoke point, so they don't have to change the oil so often. Obviously, a direct cost. They don't want it adding unwanted flavors to their product or the other things that you see here on the screen. All become their primary definitions of quality. Well, let's step back and take a look at how soybean oil, especially high oleic soybean oil, competes with other oils once perceived as healthier on the market. Now, the primary limitation of soybean oil has traditionally been its low oxidative stability. And if you're not familiar with that, that reduces shelf life, flavor, and durability at high temperatures. Now, one of the solutions to that in the past was partial hydrogenation of the oil. That increased the oxidative stability, but at the same time formed trans fats, which are undesirable because consuming them, of course, has been associated with increased heart disease in humans. A diet in fat consumption is high in oleic acid as an alternative to that, like olive oil, is associated with reduced cholesterol, arteriosclerosis, and heart disease. Now, while there's GMO high oleic soybeans or even newly released genetic engineering high oleic soybeans in the marketplace, our Emerge provided by Benson Hill line that's listed at the bottom and you see in the red box don't employ either of those methods, so are capable of carrying the non-GMO project verified certification as well as being appropriate for EU markets. We believe that high oleic oil has 20 to 60% less saturated fat than conventional soy oil and 75% less than palm oil. And for the food service industry, such as restaurants, caterers, and et cetera, that extended fry life compared to conventional soy oil and increased functionality for food manufacturers include keeping that food shelf stable and preserving flavor. Benson Hill has a variety that combines both this high oleic oil trait with the low linolenic trait, as well as low raffinose and stachyose in the soybean meal that we just discussed was important to the poultry breeder. Again, those provide opportunities in the industry. So as we look at some of those options, a little comparison if we look at some of the other opportunities in oil and where they don't really meet all of those needs in that commercial market. So you see on the left whether it's project non-GMO project verified, the flavor profile, the cost for the end user, or even the quality of that oil, you see it isn't down until you get to the high oleic soybean oil, and particularly the emerge that we're talking about, that it really checks all of those boxes and I think creates opportunity. In fact, in November of 2018, the FDA confirmed and approved a label claim on the relationship between consuming monounsaturated fatty acids and a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. Okay, let's stop again and go back and queue up the next poll question. So we were talking about oil in the U.S., but note the difference in this question is asking the most used source of cooking oil in the world. Go ahead and take a moment and see which one you think that is. Okay, I'll give you just a couple more seconds if you'd like to answer and haven't yet. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. Actually, the list on the left is in the reverse order in its use in the world. So while soybean oil is the most used in the United States, globally, palm oil is the most used oil. For a third and final example, let's look through the eyes of a plant-based meat replacement food company. Here, flavor's king. Their product must not only taste like meat, it has to have similar texture and visually look like meat, even to the point of bleeding like meat. Like one of the key factors that consumers say have them trying plant-based meat is the health benefits, real or perceived. And while different companies have sourced the protein from different plants, they all need the ability to scale up rapidly with their supply of food ingredients. I was just reading recently that according to the Good Food Institute, last year plant-based foods were already a $4.1 billion retail market, and plant-based burgers are the fastest growing category within that. Beyond Meat has been one of the hottest IPOs of 2019. Plant-based meat market is projected to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars in value in the next 20 years alone. So this is not just a niche, this is a real market opportunity. One of the limiting factors in using soy as a protein source in plant-based meat replacement is that flavor. Soy can sometimes contain a beany or grassy bitter or even other flavors that are not always desirable in the food product. Some of the ingredients used to mask those off flavors, such as salt and sugar, in large quantities obviously negatively impact the health profile of that burger. One of the reasons consumers say they're actually going for it. The processing done doesn't always fully solve that flavor issue either. And the more processed the food, the more it can be perceived negatively by consumers. Through breeding and using our full science kit, we can work on the pathways to limit those flavors or those negative flavors within the protein source. So Teresa, let's queue up the final poll question for the day. This one's a little more personal for you, and we're asking you about your own experience. So please take a moment, read through these options, and let us know how often have you eaten a plant-based meat replacement. Take just a couple more moments before we close the poll. Okay, looking at those results, it looks like the audience here really represents a lot of the market in which it's not just a small niche that's trying this. They're even targeting the plant-based meats at meat eaters. It's not always replacing meat, although in some cases it is. In some, it's expanded to protein consumption. So I come back to this visual that we started with today. I think in summary, we've looked down the food chain to look through the eyes of the poultry feeder. Then we looked at a commercial fryer, and then just most recently at the plant-based meat replacement company. Now, we're not pitting farmers at the far left against the rest of the value chain. Rather, I think through the examples we've looked at, I believe we're growing the size of the pie with new opportunities. These new and growing value chain needs create premium growing opportunities for those ready to seize them. So let's look at our call to action. What does this mean for us as an industry? In seed sales, I always used to teach in training classes that the first words you have to learn is, it is their farm. That means on the farm, the farmer gets to decide what to grow. But remember, it's always a good day to listen to your customers, no matter where they are in the value chain. And so we need to hear the needs of all of those customers in the value chain. and consumers are flexing their might. In the famed words of that baseball historian Yogi Berra, if the fans don't want to come out to the ballpark, no one can stop them. And so there's power as we move down the value chain. But I think there's an opportunity to create more value if we can connect the members of the chain from the left to the right and have them be more responsive to the others. We can start by sharing more of the information we have. As I mentioned, as I look at our seed catalog, we would lay out crude protein and oil percent, but we also know the amino acid profiles of our seed and meal and are starting to share those with our customer base because it's important. New knowledge and breeding tools allow us to challenge old assumptions, such as having to trade yield to get higher protein. We can breed for the higher value components in grain that our end users desire and still make agronomically sound varieties available. Now, I opened the presentation with a reference to Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and we'll close with a quote from that classic that I think is relevant to our review of the soybean industry. And here's what Mr. Scrooge said from his new perspective. He wasn't standing on the Great Wall of China, but I think this is relevant. He said, "I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach." I believe if we're open to listening to all of the customers in the value chain, there are lessons for us to reach. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex to start looking at some of the questions that you have for us.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Well, we're going to enter in now to our Q&A session of the webinar. If you have a question for Jeff that you haven't typed in yet, please go ahead and type it into the chat box below and we'll answer it shortly. So Jeff, in your presentation, you brought up these three markets that you thought could give us different views into different markets than our usual soybean markets. Focus more on, the soybean meal, the oil, and the soybean protein levels. Which market, in your opinion, do you see as being most lucrative or successful in the future, if any of these three?
Great question, Alex. I'm going to answer that from a couple perspectives, and I hope that doesn't sound like waffling. Clearly, we saw that from soybeans, 70% of that, over 70% of that in the U.S. is being used for animal feed. And of the soybean meal, 48 pounds approximately of every 60 pounds, 98% of that is going to animals at present. So I think that's probably early on the biggest opportunity. And yet, I think we're at a tipping point with the oil when it's the most common used oil in the market in the U.S., well over 50%. I think there's an opportunity for that market to swing very quickly because of the health considerations and extra value that high oleic oils present. And yet you can't deny looking at Beyond Meat's performance and some of the statistics I quoted from the Good Food Institute at just how rapidly that food market is growing. And plant-based meat, while the fastest growing part of that, isn't even the largest component. The largest component of that is soybean milk or other non-dairy milk options. So waffled a little bit, but I think there's lucrative opportunities in all three.
Perfect. Thank you so much. David in our audience asked, what maturity ranges does Benson Hill offer for the emerge high oleic soybeans? And sorry, I can repeat that question if you need.
No, I have it. Thank you. I think currently on again, two parts to that answer. I believe in our current commercial lineup, we go from about a 1.2 maturity on the short end to a 5 on the fuller season end. But through some work we're doing with USB, we're trying to make maturity range that oil possible across all the soybean ranges. So there's currently research being done to put those products on the market to extend those ranges beyond the ones I mentioned in the current commercial varieties. Next question.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just compiling questions here now. Along that same question, another audience member asked, John asked, what are the premiums growers can expect? I assume with the emerge soybeans.
Yeah, premium opportunities. There's a lot of variety out there, and some of the grain traders in the room might be able to tell me more. But I'll give you a few different examples. We see for just growers currently, oftentimes anywhere from $1.50 to over $2 opportunities for growing in a lot of the current markets. But I think as we start looking down that chain, and you think beyond just delivering grain, and then you start to say, if we stack those traits, so now maybe I'm growing a soybean that has both a high oleic oil, which adds value, and special qualities in the meal that provides even more value. I think then if you start saying that I can not only do that, but now I can go beyond that and start hitting specific amino acid profiles and deliver to a specific feed user. An example, if you're looking at barges going down the Mississippi River, there's one price for commodity soybeans. There's a higher price for a mixed lot of non-GM soybeans, but not similar variety, or not all the same variety. And there's even a higher price when you have a single variety in that barge of 50 to 60,000 bushels where we know the specific traits of that. So the answer isn't specific, but it varies based on the value that you're delivering to the end user. If you watch markets, you would see the price of soybean meal is very much tied to the value of the nutrients within that soybean meal. Next question.
Thank you so much. I think this is a question for your recommendation from Aaron. How does a seed grower, conditioner, and packager get started with growing seed focused on food grade soybean seed?
Well, certainly when we think about handling identity preserved grain, that's different than handling commodity grain. One of the challenges of our current system is for all of the identity preservation different seed companies are putting into commodity crops and the patents and the technologies they put. When that gets blended at the elevator, we often lose that identity preservation. So that value is lost past that point. So I think part of that is starting to say, where are those markets? And you have to go to where those markets are. Where are the processors? Where are the animal feeders that are using that? But then, we have markets all over. There's websites available that will show contract opportunities, specifically in soy, for example. You can go to some of the different soy sites and see those. If someone wants to drop me a mail, I can point you to those, and they'll point out some of those premium opportunities. But as different companies work with non-GM or some of the other specialty type traits, depending on where we're growing those, we need to work with processes in that area. So I think it's just a matter of conversations. I'm excited. I'll be having a lot of those types of conversations at the upcoming ASTA meetings in Chicago.
Perfect. Thank you so much. The next question comes from Mike, who asks, how important is your gene editing technology to develop the specialty beans? And it's a two-parter question, so I apologize. And how do you think that will play with the non-GMO certified for Emerge oil?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, I think at Benson Hill, we regularly say that we are technology agnostic, meaning that we believe in using all of those particular tools available to us for different markets, but the market gets a discussion of what it needs. I think the food market is probably the most sensitive to some of the technologies. We have seen, for example, there is a GE high oleic oil on the market, but it's not seen as non-GM project verified at this moment. So it's a new technology working through the regulations. It's hard to say. In some countries, that'll be seen as non-GM. In other countries, it may not be seen as non-GM. So we have to see a bit how the market and regulations play out that way. But I think if you look at different parts of the value chain, that has importance in some and not others. For example, if you look at the plant-based meat, our last example we worked through, one of the companies mentioned is very strong about using non-GM product. And another is very outspoken that it really doesn't matter, and both of them are growing tremendously. So both have opportunity in the marketplace. I think as we look at animal feeders, the vast majority of the soybean meal they're using now is not non-GM, so that's not as important in that particular market. So it really depends on which customer and which part of the value chain you're targeting towards.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Our next question kind of is still along the same lines of the oil and what Benson Hill is doing in that area. This is from Try. And the question is, you've mentioned a couple of different types of soybean and the oil that comes with it, like the high oleic oil and things like that. But will Benson Hill sell, and you'll pardon me if this is the incorrect way to say this, but HOLL oil?
Yeah, the HOLL stands for high oleic low linolenic. And we currently have varieties that have the high oleic low linolenic, and we have varieties that without that. So we currently are selling both. As we work with members down the value chain, in some places they only want part of that soybean grain. They want the meal or they want the oil. And Benson Hill will work with all of those folks based on what they need, and we'll use the tools we have. And I think that's really the message of this webinar. If you listen to specific customers, there's different markets, but it's not going to be one bean fits all. But I think those ingredient components really create the opportunity. So specifically, yes, we are offering those, and that choice is really dependent upon what the value chain desires. The customer gets a vote.
Perfect. We have another question from John, and I think this is going back to his first question about the emerge soybean and the premiums growers can expect from it. He asks, how stable is the 18-to-1 ratio?
Not sure I understand the 18-to-1 ratio. Maybe we could have a follow-up on that.
Oh, here, we have a follow-up on that. Sorry about that. How stable is the 18-to-1 ratio in different geographies and stress conditions? That was his final question that he answered.
Certainly, soybeans and their components change with environment. Environment and genetics both impact those year to year, sometimes more than location to location. But typically, we would say as you move south and as you move east, we tend to see a little higher protein level in the same soybean. Those ranges might be 3 or 4 points, might not be uncommon in the kind of ranges you can see over years in different parts. You can see differences in the concentration of the amino acid profiles. That's one of the reasons we will profile that grain across locations it's grown, so they understand what they're getting when they're putting that into a feed ration. So some traits, though, are not as subject to the environmental impact. If we look at the oil profile, for example, the high oleic, we haven't seen that same type of fluctuations across the environments. That's much more stable. I hope I answered the question that John had there. You can do a follow-up if I didn't.
Perfect. Thank you. And then are you going to have commercial acreage for emerge soybeans in 2020?
By commercial, if you mean, are we intending to grow? And I would say absolutely. I'm challenged to do that with the company. As we work with our distributors and licensees, we're ramping up our seed supplies. We're ramping up acres as these new technologies become available, and there's a lot of excitement around them. It's always a challenge to grow as fast as we can. And so, yeah, absolutely, we're increasing that. And if you want to talk about those opportunities, please give me a contact.
Perfect. Kind of along those same lines about what Benson Hill is doing, will Benson Hill pursue stacking multiple specialty amino acid traits in the coming years?
Yeah, absolutely. When the value comes, for example, we used one example earlier in the call after I talked about the oil, and that Benson Hill already has varieties available that would have the low raffinose stachyose on the anti-nutritionals in the meal with the high oleic oil. In other cases, a feeder might want low raffinose and stachyose with low trypsin inhibitor, along with a good solid protein quantity. So as those traits are complementary and you can put those together, certainly, if that's what the market demands.
Perfect. Thank you. And then David just followed up with me on the previous question, and he said, Are you going to have commercial acreage, meaning will processors have contract acres for the emerge in 2020? Sorry about that. Thank you so much for
Uh,
following up, David.
no, I do appreciate that. Certainly, we have more of some than others. We're currently in the process of doing things such as feeding trials or working with different end users to sample grains to see where we go. And as those have needs, we'll ramp those up. So depending on where you need that grown, the quantities you need, the answer varies. So please contact me and I'd be more than happy to walk you through that.
Thank you. So now I'm going back to your whole presentation again, Jeff, but we chatted throughout this presentation about the idea of changing our mindsets to help the future and to help get better nutrition out to, malnourished people across the globe. But that sounds like such a big task. So in your opinion, how can we work on banding together to change the mindsets of soybeans across the agricultural landscape?
Yeah, I certainly used some global examples, but I also used a large amount of really focus in the U.S. and just looking at all the opportunities we have here. Although I would say from the non-GM project verified oil, that's really important if we want to market into Europe, for example. So it really depends on where things are going around the world. But we have clients around the world who are already asking about some of these specialty traits as we look at those opportunities in different places. And we look at the amount of the U.S. soybean exports. I think history shows us that over time in the past, 1 out of 4 rows of soybeans has been exported to China, for example. So those opportunities are there. There's tons of opportunities here in the U.S. and there's tons of opportunities around the world. Did I answer your question, Alex?
I think you did. Thank you so much. And then let's see. You mentioned a downside to using soy protein for things like plant-based meats or things like that. Proves difficult because one of the major challenges is the taste, of course. How do you think technologies like gene editing are going to work together with breeders to correct and further open that market and further work on improving that taste? Or do you think in the end it's just going to be more beneficial just to start working on things to mask the flavor?
Well, I think the answer is a little bit of all of the above because all of the above is happening right now. They're already using some of the things we talked about, whether it's like simple things like salt or sugar to mask some of those flavors. It's a little more complicated, but as we get into the science and understand there's 3 common pathways we talk about that get at that flavor. And looking at the whole suite of tools that we have from traditional breeding and all the things that's given us, we're already working on some of those. Certainly some other tools that have come along allow that also. We believe a lot of those tools will even be very acceptable throughout the food market. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. It's a matter of matching those end uses with that. It's a relatively new market. And so it takes a while to breed the tools, put those there. But we have some products coming out already for some of those markets, as do others in the industry. And that's why I think it's an exciting time to be in agriculture.
Great. I think we have just about enough time for one more, Jeff, but when will Benson Hill sell Emerge HOLL oil in the Asian market? If maybe ever.
I think the question is when I have a customer, or the answer is when I have a customer ready to buy it. I would say already we have customers looking at oil, and not just from the oil standpoint. We've also seen that there's things looking at in the Asian market for using it potentially in tofu to add to the shelf life of the tofu. So it might be even just a little bit different need than just thinking about the traditional use of oil. So I think it's, as we talk to those markets regularly and as my distributors and licensees talk with those markets, we're seeing opportunities there today already.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for that great Q&A session. But I think that's about all the time we have today. I'd like to thank our speaker, Jeff, for joining us today and for Benson Hill for making this webinar possible. And I just want to give a big thank you to all of you who sat and participated with us and for all of your questions. And I hope we've been able to give you some information of value. Again, a recording of this webinar is going to be made available later today or tomorrow at seedworld.com, and you should be receiving an email with the presentation and the recorded webinar as well. Thanks again, and we just hope you have a terrific day. This is Alex Martin of Seed World signing off.